So good evening, everyone. My name is Jessie Jim. I am the NAPS Project Field Coordinator. This evening's presentation is going to cover ram selection and New Mexico State University Extension Livestock Specialist. Dr.Marcy Ward will provide the presentation this evening. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the screen over to you, Marcy, and we'll get started with your presentation.
Okay, well, thank you, Jessie, for inviting me to kind of switch gears and go to sheep. We're going to talk about ram selection as it relates to improving some of the genetic traits and profitability of your herd. So some of the things we'll discuss tonight is, obviously, why is selecting the right stud important? Potential rams that meet your breeding objective, and we'll kind of go over that a bit. Where are these rams and studs, whatever you want to call them, heading? There's new ways to select rams with more data and information that is catching up with the cattle industry. And then obviously we want to think of other things such as structure, disposition, and the like, and we'll visit about that as well. With the ultimate goal of knowing how long will it take. And again, that goes back to what your goals are in your particular flock. So there's a couple ways you can go about it. So if your goal is to merely get lambs on the ground or wool produced, you can do so with really any ram of an appropriate breed. And get what you need in terms of that. But if you're looking for improved multiple births, improved lambs at weaning, reduce need for, if there's parasite resistance, improve that, or improve your fleece. There's all these things that you can do through appropriate information. It might cost a little more for these rams to incorporate into your herd or flock, but it could be worth it in terms of profitability and health. Okay. So why is selecting the right ram for you important? Obviously, genetic progress is an ultimate goal, in that you continue to improve, you continue to get the most you can with the resources you have available to you. And it takes work to find these animals, and it can be challenging at times to find these animals, but hopefully tonight I'll give you some tools on some things you can use to get that done. So this is a pretty simplistic graph, but it does show that you can make progress in overall fleece weight. So just a net increase in pounds of fleece sold can certainly improve with the same number of sheep you had before, will improve your profitability and your ability to stay in business. And so with wool traits being fairly heritable, there's good opportunity to do that with the right ram. So again, finding those rams that meet your goal is what's important. So things that you would want to do is compare some information on your rams that you're looking to buy potentially. Now, it does, again, like I said, take a lot of homework on your part, or finding a breeder that's really open to giving you as much information as they can. So similar to the cattle industry, there's several things you can look for. Weather trials, meaning do they have access to performance of their offspring in feedlots, or carcass data, anything like that. If you're looking to market the lamb component of the crop, you can compare bloodlines. There are differences within breeds. You can test these rams for yourself. That's always a good way to evaluate if you're making progress. Now, these guys don't break up ewes in specific numbers, right? So I'm going to cover these 20 and you cover those 20. It's usually, or 40, whatever your ratio is. Some rams are more prolific than others. So you might have more lambs on the ground out of one particular ram versus another. And that can be important to know as well. The Merino Benchmark, that goes back to fleece standards that you can also utilize as information. And then like I said, if the breeders of these rams are willing to give you their own record information, meaning average birth weights of the lambs, survival rates of lambs, weaning weights, that kind of thing, wool quality data, that can all help you make those decisions. And then this is critically important in New Mexico. Are they raised in similar conditions as you? Meaning if you were to take an animal from central Missouri and bring him in because his numbers look good, he's likely not going to survive very long in western New Mexico. So ideally you want to buy as close as local as you can for that particular reason. So where are the genetics headed? We'll discuss that a little bit. We're starting to see some growth in the data side of ram selection. And specifically, how does your breeding objective align with your commercial objective? So that sounds like a little bit of a complicated question, but you can certainly have both. You know, if you're looking to breed and improve your wool and then sell the wool, that is effectively meeting your commercial objective. Okay. It doesn't matter that if it does not align, then you're probably dealing with a situation that you have inappropriate rams for your goals. And so that would require some data collection, not data, but certainly record keeping to evaluate your breeding program first before you really look to maybe change things up or improve the genetics of your flock. So how to determine a stud's likely progress, a ram's progress. Again, data is power, data is information. And the thing we need to know is what's called the selection differential, meaning how does he rate against other rams that are used in the stud process. And then from that, what are you to gain with that selection? Like how much better is he than your flock's average? I hope that makes sense. So how do we do this? How do we create this differential? How do we know what our benchmarks are? Like I said, record keeping is the best way to first do that by balancing what you are specifically seeing on the ground versus your criteria. Is it matching? And then we're going to talk a little bit more about these EBVs. It's called estimated breeding values, and how you can utilize this little bit of information coming with these rams that could be beneficial in your selection process. Indexes are also a way of making these selections as well. An index is something that combines a bunch of traits together and puts an economic dollar to it. So the estimated breeding values are the genetic performance side of things, estimating what the offspring are going to do. So if you are also raising cattle, you might be familiar with EPDs when you buy bulls. It's basically the same concept, okay? So it is an idea that a specific trait of a ram will give you an idea of what he exactly is going to contribute to your program on a specific trait. Okay, so right now, there's a lot of internet information. You can go to websites, learn a lot about these EBVs, but you can't, I know this sounds sort of silly to bring it up, but the reason I do is because this is something that's coming down the pike as being more prevalent in the sheep industry, and it's good to be ahead of the game in that regard. But it is difficult to find rams that are registered with these EBV values at this time. That said, it's good to know in your mind what these different traits are going to be, what the values of these traits are going to look like. And so when that information is made more readily available, you are ready to make some really good selection decisions. So similar to EPDs, it is a collection of data to include the actual performance of an animal, the relatives, meaning down into that ram's pedigree, what their performance was, adjusting for the environment, which that really influences how heritable a trait is, and then the correlated traits and their heritabilities as well. The more information you have that go into these values, the more accurate those values are, and the more ensured you are that these animals are going to do what they say they're going to do. Okay. When you buy an animal just on visual appraisal alone, that's fine because structure is relatively heritable, but it's not telling you, how good is his wool quality? Is he going to throw multiples? Because you typically buy your rams at a year of age, maybe a little older. And so it's challenging sometimes without that backup information. So like I said, almost all other livestock industries, not just cattle, but swine and poultry and all these have these breeding values within their own species. And it works. We've got a lot of evidence to show a great success by incorporating this as a selection tool. Certainly it shouldn't be used exclusively as a tool, as structure, disposition, and the like are just as important. But we want to have everything we have in our toolkit to make progress, right? So 4%, they are seeing that breeders in the sheep industry that are using EBVs right now, and again, this is early in the game, relatively, are seeing a 4% gain. That doesn't sound like a lot, but again, if you think about it, you are getting more outputs, whether it be wool or lambs or number of lambs, with the same number of sheep, okay? And that's where that efficiency factor comes in. So I have a link here. When we're done, I'll try and quickly put it in the chat box for you to look at. But basically, it's a definition of each of these estimated breeding values, what they mean and what the values are, whether you want to look for a positive value or a negative value and the like. And this is through the National Sheep Improvement Resource Program. Okay. So here, I'm just going to briefly go through the traits that we consider that would be considered an EBV, but also these are traits, if you're taking good records, you can still have generational progress by looking at these specific criteria. So birth weight of those lambs is important. In some cases, you do want a negative number so you don't have lambing problems. But more importantly, number of lambs born and number of lambs weaned, in my mind, from a profitability standpoint, is where you might want to focus. But again, that depends on breed. There are breeds that are designed for multiples, meaning more than twins. And then you have breeds that are more designed for singles, something like Colombians that are a dual purpose breed. So the more you focus on growth or the black-faced sheep, the less likely you're going to have multiple births. So again, it depends on breed, but you want to consider that for profitability. For replacements to scrotal circumference, in the ram side as this estimated breeding value, but also physically, the bigger the scrotal circumference, it can be tied to maturity of his offspring. The larger the scrotal circumference could represent that these lambs will mature earlier out of him. So when I talk about parasite resistance, we think this is important too. We know that sheep have in areas problems with anthelmintic or dewormer resistance, meaning they just don't work. And the reason that it is because the parasites that they're infested with have become resistant to those drugs. So to combat that, and it's particularly a problem in sheep specific. So to combat that, the sheep improvement program is looking for traits of worm egg count, and you want a negative number there. And that gives you an indication that this animal is more likely to be resistant to parasite infestation and have a lower need for any type of worming or intervention that way. So certainly from that standpoint, to me, I would want a replacement that has been bred to be more disease resistant in that regard. Now, if you're looking, they all have lambs. Lambs are one of your main market points, right? And if you have haired sheep, it's the market point. And so this might be an area of traits you would focus on. Weaning weight clearly is one. Post-weaning gains, they're fairly heritable along with weaning weight. And so those are two traits I like to look at when selecting for growth specific because it will be reflected in the weaning weight ultimately. And then also you can throw in there some carcass traits with fat depth and the loini depth, muscle depth, excuse me. I can take a drink of coffee. So if you think about it, the bigger the loini, the thicker the muscle the animal, the heavier the weaning weight. So those should tie hand in hand. Something you want to think about when selecting for a specific series of traits, such as growth, you can give up reproduction on the female side. So we don't want to do that necessarily. So if this is something that you really are wanting to maximize your profits through the lambs, it would be more of a terminal, what's called a terminal cross, meaning that you would want to, and I just realized my slide didn't make it in. I thought I saved. Anyway, so if you have a terminal cross plan, that means you don't keep any replacements back. You sell all lambs for meat product, and then you can focus on something like growth. Now, if you have the wool breeds, certainly this is fairly heritable overall, wool quality. And so this is something to consider when you are selecting rams as well. Fleece weight, just net fleece weight means more pounds of fleece per animal. And fiber diameter, you want smaller fiber diameter that typically improves the quality. Staple length, again, is tied to quality. Fiber diameter, coefficient of variation, that's a fancy word for uniformity in the fleece, okay? You want to make sure that the fleece is fairly uniform, that you don't have a bunch of coarse hair mixed in with a bunch of fine hair. And then fiber curvature is the crimp, right? So on paper, they say to look for a higher number in that EBV for fiber, for crimp, but we know that it's sort of a catch-22. Sometimes those real crimpy fleeces tend to be more coarse. So you take that one with a bit of a grain of salt. So what is the selection differential for rams used for? Okay, so the genetic progress is maximized when the selection differential is fine-tuned through the feedback of his offspring of purebred sheep within that registry, okay? the higher the selection differential, the more returns to gain for the ram's progeny, right? Which means the data that contributed to that ram and made him superior will just make that purchase of him more profitable for you. So when we say superior, what do we mean? Superior in what trait? And we did cover the traits, but we need to understand heritability factors a huge role into how quickly you're going to be productive in a specific trait, or you're going to see growth or gain. Okay, so phenotypic traits are those that can be measured, can be seen, photo. So you can measure wool quality. You can measure weaning weights, right? Some that are less black and white would be maternal abilities, that kind of thing, that's more of a objective criteria, but it's still measurable, right? You have good moms and you have bad moms. And so record keeping is pretty important when it comes to really fine-tuning your heritability. But the sticker in all this is environmental effects. So if you've ever read up on or seen or watched progress of cloning, you will see, and I'll use the performance horse industry first, because that sort of gives you a pretty clear picture of the environmental effects on heritability. So clones are genetically identical, right? So if, say, you have two cutting horses that are cloned, genetically the same, but you have one that's a champion and one that never performs. So if they're genetically the same, right, how is it that there's such a vast difference in the outcome? And that goes back to the influence of the environment, allowing those animals to express those genetics. So for weaning weights, highly affected by environmental situation, right? If you're in drought, if say the ewes aren't milking because there's not enough feed, this is going to impact your outcome for weaning weights. Reproduction also, it's very lowly heritable, and the reason that is because so much management ability, drought, just the environment, feedability, nutrition, all of that can tie into reproductive failure or success. And so pretty lowly heritable. So on these traits that are lowly heritable, there's no need to really focus on trying to improve them, because you'll pull your hair out, because you'll be making progress and then you'll get hit with a pretty tough summer and those ewes won't breed. And then what do? Do you keep them or do you remove them? So, so that's the kind of thing that you're challenged with in terms of heritability. Okay. So it's simple. So make a list of specific things you want to accomplish in these production goals or your breeding objectives, and then do some homework to see how heritable or how much the environment might impact that. And a lot of it's common sense, right? When the environment or management plays a bigger role in what the genetics can do. So the selection differential 2 is finding those rams that outperform the group, or their contemporary group is what it's called. And that can also give you an idea of what to expect in terms of how he'll improve your profitability. Something else to consider, say he was exceptional in wool quality, well, you have a pretty good chance that you will improve the wool quality in his offspring. So he would be one you would probably keep ewe lambs out of if that's your goal, is to prove wool quality of your herd. And that's how you get that done. Like I said, weaning weights, a little less heritable because there's just too much that can have negative impacts on that. That said, if you get a ram that's exceptional in weaning weights, then he might make up that difference on those tough years. So here just gives you an example, right, of why we like to see this selection differential. Is say you have a dam C crossed with sire D, and their weaning weight of that lamb is 60 pounds. But then sire D here was crossed with a better ewe, and their weaning weight was 85 pounds. So this 20% variation is due to genetic variation between the dams. Now you can easily flip that and improve it across your entire flock by getting a 20% higher performing ram. I hope that makes sense. On the wool side, again, a good way to make progress, for example, say your whole group averages 21 microns in their wool quality test, okay? What microns are the diameter of that fiber. And so that's fairly average, but the lower the number, the finer the wool. So say you've got a ram that's going to score around 17 microns on average, and you cross him with your herd, the contribution will eventually result in an average herd wool quality of 18 microns. So you've made progress. And that is the selection differential that you're going for. So realizing many things. First, this all sounds well and good. Tough to find that information on rams right now. Tough to find rams sometimes, right? The network of finding purebred sheep breeders for commercial purposes can be challenging at times. For genetic diversity, for hybrid vigor, it's not the best idea to keep lambs as replacements for your current flock, even though it's a little cheaper to do it that way. You're really going to get yourself in a pigeonhole into lacking progress and even going backwards. So now the next step would be put your eyes on them, because you do have the ability to do that. That information is there, and very recommended, okay? Even if you start to do the deeper dive of looking at these breeding values, seeing how they can help build your herd, you really need to put eyes on that animal as well, because the numbers alone don't necessarily tell you the tale. You want to start off by muscle structure, whether your intent is for wool or not. You need a really nice, thickly muscled ram. The thicker the muscle, they just tend to hold up longer, and it is heritable. Clearly, if they're thick muscled, they're pretty good in their carcass, and passing that on to their lambs are going to look really good for your buyers. So just looking for a nice, deep-bodied, thick ram, has a balanced structure, length of skeleton, and I put question marks by frame. We don't want little guys that maybe can't get the job done and might go backwards on your overall weaning weights, but you can get too big, right? The Colombian breed, for example, fits in a lot of tough country. But these guys are pretty framey. They're pretty big. They can weigh well over 200 pounds. And so you got to keep that in mind when you are selecting rams for your area. Will they be able to make it through the winter or a drought? Scrotal circumference, very important. This particular picture, he's not really all that impressive in that category from a side view, but scrotal circumference is directly proportional in many ways to his fertility. So you do want to take that into consideration. So just some obvious structure notes. Feet and legs are very important, particularly when you're in rougher country. You need something that can stand up to that. And if they're off in their structure, they're going to pass it on to their offspring, and they're probably going to break down sooner. This is an he is an investment that you need to keep for several years. And so these are pretty, standard descriptions of structure, whether it be a front view, side view, or rear view. You basically, the take-home message is you want straight in the front and back, right? You don't want toes out, toes in, knees in, hocks out, and then placement of the pastern, here you want fairly straight as well. Camped under is okay, but you can get it too extreme. And then are they keeping, their feet and toes? That's, again, fairly heritable. If they grow long toes and for whatever reason, that can affect their ability to cover ground. Something else to consider too are birth defects. Certainly you don't want to purchase a ram that has any of these things because he will pass it on to his offspring. But if you find animals in a lamb crop with any of these issues, excuse me, you don't want to keep the ewe lambs out of them either, okay? So jaw malformations, parrot mouth, it's probably most common you'll see in sheep. This is when they're over in their bite. You can get undershot, the bulldog mouth. You get these inverted eyelids too. They can be fixed, but again, pretty heritable. So you want to avoid that. And hopefully the person you're buying a ram from, this is one that if they get it fixed, you may not be able to detect when you buy him. Certainly the mouth issues are, but evaluate that. And then when you have one of these issues crop up, you really want to figure out who the daddy is. And if it doesn't seem like he is the culprit, that it was just a random recessive gene that reared its ugly head, it might be the ewe. Either way, these animals need to go. So the basics too to consider is, and one I think people miss a lot, is they assume he's fertile. And we know on the beef side of things, that's a standard veterinary procedure. When you buy a bull, you need to make sure he's fertility tested. When you own bulls, you get them fertility tested every year. This is something in the sheep industry that we really don't do probably thoroughly enough. And I've heard of multiple incidences where all of a sudden a lamb crop is cut pretty significantly because one ram was not fertile. And so that is something you can work with your veterinarian on. You should work. It does require special equipment to get this done, but it's very similar to a beef animal's BSE exam. And so to know that this ram is fertile at the beginning of the breeding season is critically important prior to turning him out. And then in the purchase, and when purchasing, just require it. Say, I will buy your ram, but please provide a breed soundness report within the last 30 days. And then, is he healthy? That you can sort of do an eye assessment of. You can kind of tell based on body condition if he's had any health issues. Sorry, very dry throat. What's his vaccine history? And so you should be able to get at least that much information. And disposition, right? So we think of sheep as, well, they're maximum 250 pounds-ish on the big side and what damage, but they can really knock you down, they can hurt you, and they can be very problematic in terms of disposition. And so depending on your setup and what you're willing to deal with, keep in mind disposition is very heritable. He'll pass it on to his offspring, and that can impact how, on the female side, reproduction potentially. If they're high stress animals by nature, they tend to not breed that well, or in the feedlot, they certainly are more susceptible to sickness and poor performance. So again, very important, if I were to go look for, say, a ram and he's in a lush green field, almost knee-high in grass, I would be and fatter than a tick, I would be very suspect of that animal's ability to survive in conditions like this over here on the right. So remember, keeping always your production goals in mind, and that will help you focus on your selection criteria for the rams that you buy. Will the breed fit your resources? Okay. And do they fit your market? Do you have a market for the breeds you might be interested in? What is your ultimate goal in terms of that? Biggest challenge I see in New Mexico is finding the rams that you want. So you sometimes are limited as to breed that you use simply due to the fact that there's only so many purebred breeders in the state or regionally that you can keep changing your rams up. Even if you keep within the breed, it's important to change your rams up to keep that hybrid vigor. And then take advantage of their assets, take advantage of all the information that you could possibly gain on that animal before purchasing him, because that can add to more rapid progress in your flock. So with that, I guess I'll stop sharing and take questions.
Thank you, Marcy. If you guys have any questions, you guys can raise your hand. I can unmute you, or you can type it in the box. As far as, how long you keep your rams, what's the recommended amount of years you can keep your rams?
So they don't have quite the shelf life as some other breed or other species, but I would say if you can squeeze 5 to 6 years out of them, depending on how tough their country is, they might live longer. But it's all indicative of that very important breed soundness exam. So if he's still young, but he's not, if you had a really cold winter, there can be damage done to the scrotum. And so that can be permanent, even though he has a long time to rest before he's needed again. That's something to think about. In that, I would do those breed soundness exams in the fall prior to turnout, because you just never know. So to me, that's their shelf life is their fertility. Right. As long as they're fertile, keep them going, and they're holding up. They're not losing a lot of condition. Their teeth are still kind of in okay shape. I would say keep them as long as you can, provided that the genetics aren't starting to suffer. You're not getting him on too many of his daughters.
Right. Okay. And then also, when you're selecting a ram, and I know there aren't any, any of the, I forget what it's called, any sort of information on rams, right? Yeah. Except what they look like. And, is there something they should avoid? I know there's a saying, the older the ram is, the bigger their lambs are going to be. Is that true, or does it just depend on the breed?
Depends on the breed. Certainly, they have the ability. It's not going to grow every year, but it's possible. So lamb size is more dictated on the ewe than it is the ram, because the environment that those lambs grow is kind of dictates their size. That said, birth weights are genetically heritable. And if he is born with a certain genetic potential for birth weight, he should express that throughout his life. Age, to me, I don't think would would dictate birth weight on his end, but it could on the female end simply because, if she doesn't get enough groceries while she's pregnant, the younger ewes tend to have smaller lamb, that kind of thing. It's more on the female side genetically, just because of the environment the fetuses grow in versus what the ram contributes.
Right. Okay. All right. We do have a question on the Navajo Nation. Do you know of resources that are available to get a stud tested?
I'm presuming for breed soundness exam?
Yes.
Right. So unfortunately, no, not off the top of my head. And the challenge, and one of the reasons this doesn't happen a lot, is it does require a special probe. It does require a little more training on the veterinarian side. But the charging equipment for the probe is similar to what they use for cattle. It's just they have to know the right power source to supply, and then the probe itself. So it'd be sort of up to working with your veterinarian to see if they're willing to make that investment. And that's, like I said, that is a limitation. I appreciate that not all veterinarians do it. But that said, it's an important component.
Okay. And then let me check the box here. Okay. And then another question, would you advise, what's your opinion on, if you get a Colombian ram and breed it with, say, a smaller frame, a churro ewe, what are the complications there?
Yeah, so that is a good question. If it were me, I would go the other way. I would maybe use a churro ram on Colombian ewes. But if you have ewes that have already lambed, then it shouldn't be as big a deal, because their reproductive tract has already sort of, for lack of a better word, stretched out, and their birth canal should be a little bigger. Keep in mind though, twinning versus singles, that's a heritable deal. So if you go to something that is more apt to throw singles, you just want to weigh the value of that. And you are probably on the wool side. Colombians are dual purpose, but you'll probably end up giving up some wool quality in lieu of lamb size. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. And then one last question. As far as feeding, I hear that if you feed your ewes grain, you're flushing them out,
Mm-hmm.
and then also increasing the chances of twins and triplets.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, is that true? And what feeding guidelines would you provide for people who are feeding out their rams throughout the summer and ready to turn out here in the next month?
So where are we at? We're in October already. Yeah. Wow. So flushing is a real thing. So when you up your grain, half pound all the way up to a pound, to the ewe side, and they have the genetic potential to ovulate more than one egg, grain support does help with that. So that improves their ovulation rates. So you do have a better chance of multiples with a nutrition flushing program. On the ram side, his contribution of being able to generate multiples is simply his fertility. So if he is fertile enough to cover, say, 3 embryos, then you will, the flushing with the nutrition you should work. And again, it's dependent on breed. A Colombian is not going to give you triplets with a flushing program, not necessarily. So, but she could give you twins. So it just sort of depends on the nutrition for the ewe and the fertility of the ram.
Okay, great.
And to that point, flushing him as well will help with his fertility. However, I should say you don't want to load him up on grain prior to the breeding season. We want to help him because he needs that extra energy to get ready for breeding season. But one thing that a really high grain diet does for rams, bulls, whatever, it creates acidosis, and the acidosis will cause infertility, temporary, but basically they get pus in the semen, which kills the sperm, and they're no good. They can clear of those infections, but it is almost 100% because of nutrition, too much grain, that can cause fertility issues in those rams.
Hello.
Okay. Wow. All right.
Hello.
Oops. Okay. Thank you, Marcy.
I think you have a question.
Let's see.
Sharon, somebody?
Sharon, do you have a question?
You answered my question, Marcy. It was also the same thing as what Jesse was asking about the twins.
Okay.
I thought maybe it would be like the genes in the rams that would cause like twins.
Yeah, no, that's all on the girl.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, and even, when you get identical twins, again, that's more driven by the female, the egg just splitting. And the one egg gets fertilized, but then it splits. So,
Okay.
Yeah. But fertility on the ram side is important for that.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful presentation.
Oh, thanks. It was a lot. It was a fire hose of information, I know, but hopefully we got, and the industry is going to head in this direction where you should have access to these estimated breeding values. It's just not quite there yet, but it's good to know what those stand for, and it helps maybe identify some traits to select for.
Yes. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you, Marcy. I think that concludes our Q&A session, and then we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. Our next webinar is there on the screen. It's going to be the greenhouse management provided by Diné College Land Grant Office. Webinar ID is posted up there if you guys can join us. And that's going to be on, I believe, at the end of the month. So we will, that's at the end of the month, and then the next 2 weeks, if you guys will just visit our Facebook page, or we usually send out an email a week before the presentation or the day of. So just keep a lookout. Like I said, our Facebook page is there, our YouTube channel. We have our past webinars posted on there. From this past year and the year before. And then we also disperse a monthly newsletter. And so if you would like to be part of the email listing, go ahead and email myself, Sharon, or Jana, and we will get you subscribed. And so thank you again, everyone, for joining us this evening. Join us next week, and each week we'll have a webinar, and we'll go ahead and get the email sent out. Thank you again. And when you guys exit out, there's going to be a screen that pops up, a survey. If you guys could fill that out, that will help us a lot. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and sign off. Thank you again. Thank you, Marcy, for your presentation, and thank you to our viewers. Have a good evening.
Bye.
Thank you.
The Native American Producers Success Project, or NAPS project in short, is a collaborative effort between Dene Inc., a nonprofit organization, the New Mexico Cooperative Extension Services, and Dene College Land Grant Office. This project is being funded by USDA's Office of Partnership and Public Engagement and the Outreach and Assistance for Socially Disadvantaged and Veteran Farmers and Ranchers program. The NAPS project field staff consists of myself, our assistant coordinator, Sharon Sandman, and our technology media coordinator, Jenna Johnson. The overall goal of the NAPS project is to increase the profitability and long-term sustainability of Navajo farmers and ranchers. To help us achieve this goal, there are some activities that we are currently providing in 4 key areas, which include improving Navajo farm and ranch operations through a series of workshops focusing on crop-related topics and livestock-related topics. We are also increasing our Navajo farmers and ranchers' knowledge of and access to available programs and technical assistance provided by USDA, BIA, Navajo Nation, New Mexico State University, Cooperative Extension Services, Dene College Land Grant Office, and other professionals. We are also strengthening the organizational capacity of the Navajo Farmer and Rancher Congress to address the current and future needs of Navajo farmers and ranchers. And last but not least, facilitating Navajo farmers and ranchers' use of USDA programs such as NRCS, FSA, and RMA programs.